It's 7 a.m, February the 1st, 1995, and Richey Edwards is pondering, wearing down the carpet with his rubber-soled boots as he steps back and forth between the table and the door of his hotel room. He takes one last look towards the box he has carefully and lovingly prepared for his ex-girlfriend, nods, and then defiantly grabs the cold knob of the heavy wooden hotel room door. Today, Richey will disappear forever after a life of never-ending torment with his own brain. Mental illness, alcoholism, obsession, rocky relationships, and self-punishment. This is the tragic life story that led to the disappearance of Richey Edwards. Ever since his childhood, there was something remarkably different about Richey Edwards. Raised with his sister Rachel by his grandmother Keza in the working-class Welsh town of Blackwood, Richey was a very sensitive child who repeatedly begged to rehear stories of his great-aunt Bessie, who was known as the local hermit, or his uncle Shane, who disappeared to America and left his family waiting for word of contact for over 5 years. Even as a child, it was clear that Richey had a taste for mystery and the macabre. One day, when he was about 10 years old, his sister Rachel describes that he suddenly came running out of the woods in which he'd been playing, violently screaming with tears streaming down his face. When she turned to look at where he had emerged from, she saw a boy in his late teens who was known as the town's local weirdo. Richey refused to ever tell Rachel what really happened that day. At just 13 years old, he would freakishly foretell his own future by writing a piece of fiction in which a person left home without leaving their family a note to head for the Severn Bridge, the bridge in which Richey is believed to have later took his life from. At 14, he wrote the story of a scientist who held an MP hostage until he went into hiding in South America, where he enjoyed reading the front page headlines from his secret hideaway. And at 15, another piece that eerily mentions a man having stitches removed within a mental ward, something that would later happen to Richey a mere few months before his own disappearance. Where other classmates would hand in 6 pages of work, Richey would over-excel himself and hand in 859. In the book Withdrawn Traces, his sister talks about how she believes he may have had a form of autism, previously known as Asperger's, which can often lead individuals to feel a strong sense of alienation and isolation from others. There are certainly many traits that Richey exhibits: a love of routines and timetables, his intense interests and obsessions with certain pieces of literature and music, one of which being a 1970s sitcom about a man who experienced a midlife crisis and faked his own death. Another being the band's Joy Division, where he would always choose to sit at a bench in uni that had Ian Curtis RIP written on it, being described as a mini Rain Man due to the hours of conversation he was able to keep upon one topic, and his incredible ability to recall even the most tiniest of details. He had the nicknames Android or Spock, and his love of eating the same food every day at university, pie, chips and beans, whilst being a hoarder of discarded pot noodles from his friend's factory job. Despite his high level of intelligence, he also struggled with the simplest of tasks and would often take his dirty laundry to his mother's for years after not being able to work out how to use a washing machine. As a student, Richey struggled with being extremely introverted and really didn't enjoy socializing. In a letter to his friend in 1986, he said, "I wish I never had to leave my bedroom. Then you just have yourself. I've compromised over so many things since I've left my bedroom. I wish I could stay in my bedroom forever."
Day art in any city, in any part of the world, I stay in my bedroom, I watch TV and I read and I play records, and that is like the truth.
He was painfully shy, especially around women, and extremely self-critical about his looks. A childhood friend describes how once on a really warm night, Richey woke up sweating, but was too embarrassed to remove a layer of clothing due to struggling with really bad acne. And so instead of making himself more comfortable, he actually went to lie on the floor to sleep for the rest of the night. At university, he would go to shower on his own in the middle of the night to avoid having to share a cubicle. He was also often bullied, being accused of being gay because of the androgynous way that he acted and looked. He had a very old-fashioned approach when it came to dating, showering girls with flowers and gifts, which other people often made fun of. His first infatuation was with a girl named Claire at university, but it finished quickly when she had a haircut that he despised and he heard her actually speak for the first time. He didn't have his first proper relationship until he was 21 years old, when he met another girl named Claire, who he began dating in the summer of 1988. She remembers him as being an ideal boyfriend, but sadly, due to his extreme self-consciousness, their relationship was ruined due to his trust issues and constant need to put himself down. The two never slept together, as Richey would often put a stop to things before they ever went that far, claiming that all he had left was his innocence, and he couldn't just give it away unless he was sure. During his early time in the Manics, the other boys would often call him Norfolk, meaning North, because he had told them that he had never slept with a girl.
When I lost my virginity, it was a definite act that I was 21. Everybody for years and years, been fucking around me, saying how brilliant it was. And I felt, alright, I'm not happy. Maybe there is this glorious event that's going to change your life. And so I just deliberately went out, sat in a pub, drank until somebody came up and said, "Do you want to come back to my house?" And I went back. And we felt it was very clinical. And the next day I felt, really bad. And I didn't like it.
There were many times in his life that he actually described himself as being asexual, despite being the only member of the band who allegedly slept with a hooker during the later Bangkok tour. He was also rumoured, however, to have had a lot of intimate relations with groupies, and in a lost interview tape from 1992, he admits that he had slept with hundreds of girls, but that sex without love was just completely uninteresting. "I don't care about them. They don't care about me. It's just a way of spending a night with somebody, then saying bye-bye in the morning." The adult fans, known as the Cult of Richey, who were utterly obsessed with him and saw him as their saviour due to the public pro-feminist views he displayed, openness about mental illness, and overall sensitive personality. Also had a bad reputation at one point in the media due to these fans copycatting his SH behaviour, which we will get into later. His relationship with Claire ended after she moved to Paris for a gap year. Richey begged her to come home through a series of intensely passionate love letters and phone calls. She eventually gave in and returned, for Richey to only dump her on the spot when they finally reunited, as he claimed he just couldn't deal with the way that being in a relationship made him feel.
It's very difficult to trust people.
When you're in love, I think there's a feeling of being trapped. As a student, Richey also began to indulge in more destructive habits. Despite claiming that he had never had a drink before the age of 18, he quickly took to drinking after a friend took him down the Union to buy his first pint. He had been battling sleepless nights caused by other loud and unruly students who would party all night and run around knocking on everyone's doors. He realised that drinking could help him escape the irritability of these other students and allow him to combat his insomnia.
That's why I was so disappointed with myself when I started drinking, because I didn't drink till I was at university. I didn't use drugs until I graduated. Got to a point where I could not sleep, and people said, if you have a few drinks, it'll help you get to sleep, which it did.
However, he soon began getting himself into terrible states where he would be up all night vomiting and laying down flat on the bathroom floor. His sister claims that things got so bad that his mother used to have to come and get him to sort him out.
Drinking was a really effective way for me to close off the day. But when things got too much, drink as fast as much as I could till I passed out, you know.
One time, according to an ex-housemate, he got so drunk that he accidentally vomited in several of his record sleeves, which really upset him because they were his pride and joy.
It was like, on my mind for days, and it was all really important. I think if you're quite lonely, you just find something in your life which becomes really crucial. And for me, I didn't have many friends apart from, the band, and the music was really vital.
Sadly, alcoholism ran in Richey's family, as his great-grandmother died at the age of 41, with the cause of death being chronic alcoholism, which led to heart failure. In 1987, his beloved grandmother, who'd helped raise him, died, and Richey was absolutely distraught. It was shortly after this that Richey's mental state really began to decline for the worse. He started to actually physically inflict pain upon himself by drawing and stabbing on his leg with a compass through his jeans. This was something that would only get worse and would begin to really plague Richey throughout the rest of his life, being often known to stub out cigarettes on his arm or himself.
But you hurt yourself all the time, not only abuse of drugs and alcohol, but you yourself. I mean, that's one of the things I can't understand at all. Do you have any explanation for that?
I think it's quite common. It's on the increase. It's all about self-discipline, finding some worth in yourself, knowing that you've got the discipline to do it. It's also, I think, really connected to the fact that you almost feel like silent. You have no voice, you've got no option. You're in a frame of mind where it really does not hurt. When you're in that frame of mind, it's like really natural. It's like the only logical thing to do.
Whenever I myself, I feel so much better. All the little things that have been annoying me suddenly seem so trivial because I'm concentrating on the pain. His weight, another thing that he would always struggle with, began to really plummet, and he weighed just 6 stone when he sat his final exams. Despite meeting Nikki, Sean and James during his years at Oakdale Comprehensive School, it wasn't until 1989 that Richey actually became an official member of the Manic Street Preachers, after originally being just the driver and roadie for the band. Despite being officially the second guitarist, Richey wasn't exceptionally musically talented. His main skills actually laid in writing exceptionally deep and thought-provoking political lyrics, as well as contributing artwork and being the main spokesperson for the band. His close friend Mark claims that during his obsession with music, he'd always talk about creating the ultimate band. Richey and Nikki had what Nikki describes as an evangelical desire to start a revolution. It didn't just mean getting a record deal, it was all-conquering, psycho, egotistical.
I always remember the Manics that you swore after the first album you'd break up then anyway, which you obviously didn't do.
No, I mean, that was our big ultimate aim. We wanted to be the perfect band that could make a record that sold globally, millions. And that there would be no need to make another record.
They said in interviews that they were going to sell 25 million records and then split up by burning themselves alive on top of the pops. Richey seemed obsessed with the idea of creating a legacy.
I think I have a dream of writing a lyric which I think is flawless, really.
Despite being the band's rhythm guitarist, Richey always struggled to learn guitar. He hated practicing and often mimed playing on stage during live early performances, later being turned down in the volume, and only actually played on 2 songs during the band's studio career.
It's been hard to play the guitar for a while.
Oh, it's not yourselves how to play the guitar.
Yeah, that's true. You don't even play on the album.
Well, I try my best, but I don't succeed that regularly.
He had very strong principles of keeping the band's authenticity, and he hated the idea of becoming corporate sellouts. These beliefs led to one of the most controversial moments of the band's career, when in 1991, NME journalist Steve Lamacq told him, "I just don't think a lot of people will think you're for real."
One, people might not think that you're actually, for real.
Absolutely infuriated by Lamacq's criticism, he took a razor blade and proudly carved the words "for real" into his own arm, which was famously photographed by NME photographer Ed Sears. Richey ended up being rushed to hospital for 17 stitches.
From somewhere he'd got a razor blade, and while he was talking, started to down his arm.
Conspiracy fans love to describe this as the band's blood sacrifice, as only 6 days afterwards, the Manics were signed to a record deal with Sony. In February of 1992, the band's debut studio album, Generation Terrorists, was released, but it didn't sell as well as expected due to the popularity of the grunge scene, which directly rebelled against the classic 80s hard rock sound that the album was influenced by. It did go to number 1 in the UK's rock chart, but only sold around 32,000 copies in the US. This unfortunately led to the next album being more commercial and polished in style, something that really went against Richey's original vision and principles, meaning that the next album would have to be less extreme and political in its lyrics, but perhaps darker in personal themes, maybe reflecting the further deterioration of Richey's emotional state at the time. Roses in the Hospital peaking at number 15 on the UK singles chart, which would be the highest charting single from the band's first 3 albums. During the summer after this release, Richey was to spend his first time at a health farm. When Nicky Wire married his childhood sweetheart in September, Richey was left feeling incredibly isolated, as he knew it would change the depth of the relationship he had with one of the only people he had felt so close to in his life.
I'd got married and all the rest of it. I kind of had a life outside the band. Richey never had that. He never had enough outside the band.
During this time, his on and off again girlfriend Jo, who he began dating in the early 90s, says in a conversation to his sister Rachel that she can't explain why, but she thinks that Richard was in love with Nick because of the way he acted at their wedding. He was incredibly depressed, walking around drinking and crying the whole night. His sister thinks instead that he either felt like he was losing his closest friend, or he felt jealous because he didn't have a relationship that strong himself. It was around this time that he began to get very jealous of the other band members, and his mood began to drop further as he began to accuse Jo of seeing any man she had any contact with. She says that he just began to feel absolutely worthless as a person and just needed constant reassurance. Over Christmas of 1993, Nicky remarked that Richey seemed to be beginning to feel emptier, and nothing he could say could help to make him feel any better. In early 1994, Richard began to make more impulsive decisions and to start taking more substances. He was drinking up to 1 bottle of vodka a day and drowning his sorrows in frequent meaningless groupie sex. Every time I've slept with a groupie, I've always felt dirty afterwards. In February of 1994, he gave one of the most depressing interviews of his life to a Sheffield local radio station. In April, his destructive SH tendencies seemed to be growing even more out of his control, as when the band took a trip to Bangkok, Thailand to play their Gold Against the Soul tour, Richey had been sent some miniature swords backstage with a note from a fan asking him to use them on stage. He was later found in the bathroom with his chest all slashed up, saying he didn't want to let them down. Everyone wants me to chop up my arm on stage. It's like they're waiting for a car crash to happen. What a shit thing to be remembered for. His letters to Jo also often included arguments about affecting his life. He'd also quote French philosopher Camus, who used to argue that the only big question in life was whether to yourself or not, but he also told her that she was the only person to ever make him feel safe. I have a very childlike rage and a very childlike loneliness. Just after the Bangkok tour ended, one of Richey's closest friends took his own life. Despite being really upset about it, his sister claims that he also carried a deep admiration for what he had done, and it was almost as if Richey was jealous that his friend had had the guts to do it, but he hadn't.
I think the older you get, the more life becomes more miserable. All the people you grew up with die. You know, your parents die, your grandparents die, your dog dies. You know, your energy diminishes. There's less books to read. There's no more groups to discover. You know, you just end up a barren wasteland, just trying to find something new, which never really occurs.
Perhaps this weird feeling of inadequacy led to one of the lowest moments in Richey's life, which was his attempt of the 18th of July in 1994. He called his mother and told her he'd done something he might regret. When his parents quickly travelled down to his flat, they found it in a total mess. There were empty bottles of alcohol all over the floor, alongside plenty of rubbish, and scribbled writings about Kurt Cobain, who had also recently in his life, all over the white walls. Richey was found in a bath full of freezing cold water, with blood gushing out of his arms. He had his wrists. He had left a note inside the front cover of a book that left instructions for his funeral, and the harrowing line, "I love you. I'm sorry. I just needed to feel something more." He was rushed to hospital. When his sister visited him, he was in a bad state. He'd stopped taking care of his looks, appeared dishevelled, and made very little eye contact or effort to speak. It was here that Richey was treated for severe depression and voluntarily hospitalized at a local psychiatric institution. When his sister remarked on the marks on Richey's wrists looking painful, he replied with, "It was nothing compared to the pain he was feeling on the inside." Here, Richey's mood would often fluctuate between flat and depressed, or anxious and depressed, and he lost his ability to cope with even the smallest of problems. He was truly losing control. The hospital put him on very heavy medication that calmed him down and helped him to sleep, but it made him barely able to talk. It was so sedating.
He was in a terribly bad way. He really was. And, you know, when he went to the NHS mental home then, I was probably, you know, the word, like, when I saw him then, it was, you know, it was pretty hard. He was drugged out of his skull.
One day during a visit with James, he suggested that he should leave the band. James agreed and said it would be best for him to step down from performing and just concentrate on the artwork and lyrics instead. As soon as James arrived home, however, Richey phoned him very upset, saying that he changed his mind and wanted to keep his current role in the band. His sister wonders if Richey had just been testing James to see if the Manics still felt like they truly needed him in the band. Richey had often said that the band was all that he had, so actually leaving would have been devastating for him. He was moved to the famous Priory Hospital in London, where just a day's stay would cost £310 at the time. Here, Richey was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, a debilitating mental illness that causes havoc on patients' lives, often giving them intense mood swings, chronic feelings of emptiness, a struggle to understand their own identity, and strong feelings of abandonment. He was put on the maximum recommended daily dosage of Prozac. This was chosen in the hopes that it would get Richey to eat again. One of the books that Richey sent to his family after leaving the Priory had a corner of several pages folded down, where poems were that were about disappearance. Verses about slipping into madness and wandering the world were highlighted. James gave an interview on the 30th of July to the media that said, "It wasn't a breakdown, it was much worse than that. Richey went bonkers. Something just flipped in his head. It was dramatic." On the 1st of August, the Manic single Revel was released and unfortunately performed very badly, only reaching number 22 on the UK singles chart. Now, Richey's weight continued to drop even further, and in his last weeks at the Priory, his sister would see him pick at his food and then immediately excuse himself to go to the bathroom. His teeth were also starting to wear away, which is another symptom of bulimia, the act of making oneself vomit after eating.
The skinniest I've ever got is 6 stone, just under 6 stone.
Richey was also becoming ever more paranoid about the public sussing out that he couldn't actually play the guitar very well, and he would frequently express this to his bandmates and his sister. One day, instead of attending group therapy, he was found in the hospital wing having stitches and bandages on his arms again. In September, after being a patient at the Priory for 6 weeks against staff recommendations, Richey discharged himself. He felt that the treatment was pointless, and he went straight back on tour. Nicky noticed how unwell he still was after his hospitalization, and he claims that he would just have fits where he would burst out crying. New letters to his ex-girlfriend Jo said things like, "They're fools if they think I'm 100% well and healthy. You know how it is. A plastic smile always wins." Richey's last ever single with the Manics charted at only number 25 in the UK charts. In the autumn, Richey started acting very strangely, carrying around a book of Bible quotes everywhere with him, and he'd always hated religion, and writing the words love on his knuckles. In October, he was described as shaky and scared on his last ever tour, and that he just really didn't seem to want to be there at all. Terrifyingly, one night when his sister visited him, Richey seemed really off. She could tell there was something plaguing his mind. She stayed up with him all night until he finally confessed that he was having an obsessive thought about chopping off his fingers. It took hours of speaking with him and pleading with him to get him to discard it, as she knew he kept a meat cleaver under his bed. He told her that he was just terrified of being outed as a fraud, and the idea had come to him after hearing about Steve Clark, the ex-Def Leppard guitarist, purposefully breaking his own knuckles on a sink in order to avoid performing. In November, Richey wore a white boiler suit in an interview, which he wrote many lines of the poet Rimbaud's work, who had famously disappeared to travel the world and work for an export company. His other latest obsession was the film Apocalypse Now, and he had expressed that he loved the idea that Marlon Brando had just given up on fame, left the movie business after its release to go away from everyone and just live on an island for 10 years. On December the 1st, Richey was found yet again in a terrible state, covered in blood, banging his head against a brick wall outside the band's hotel in Hamburg. On the 21st of December, Richey played his last ever gig with the Manics at the London Astoria, which ended with the violent destruction of his guitar. Adrian, one of Richey's friends, recalls the last time he ever saw him. It was just before Christmas, and Richey was painfully thin. He was surviving on just one McDonald's salad every day. He also oddly mentioned wanting to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem in the new year to his sister Rachel. The month before Richey was to disappear would become an absolutely devastating month for him, as he lost his childhood dog Snoopy after he had to be put to sleep. Rachel found Richey in an absolutely inconsolable state, curled up on the floor, tears streaming down his face, whilst hugging the dog's lifeless body. She said it was the most devastated that she had ever seen him in his life. And just days before this had happened, Richey had taken a special trip to visit Jo and had proposed to her, only to be turned down, which led to the end of their on and off again 4-year relationship. He told family members that she was the only one for him and that he would never move on. The pain from the rejection led Richey to actually cut out a big chunk of his hair in frustration, revealing a huge bald spot on his head. So the next day, he shaved his head, something he had frequently done over the years when he was experiencing severe emotional trauma. His great-aunt Bessie, the hermit that Richey loved to hear stories of, also passed away during this time. Richey started to act even more strangely. He started wearing striped PJs everywhere that he went that were very reminiscent of concentration camps' uniforms. This, combined with Richey's incredibly low weight and recently shaven head, it led many people to feel very uneasy around him, as they began to associate Richey with a Holocaust victim. In January, the band began to meet at the studio to begin recording their next album, where Nicky actually claims that Richey seemed the most tranquil that he had been in years, despite arriving in only his PJs and slippers in the freezing cold.
We rehearsed for 5 days, and that was the best 5 days we'd had for, all that year. He was really on top form. He was really lovely and cuddly, and we really got on well again, all 4 of us, and everything was brilliant.
Which leads us to ask the question, was Richey feeling relieved because he knew he was making these plans to disappear and completely change his life? Or was it sadly like what many describe with victims of depression before they decide to take their own lives, as they come to this immediate sense of relief as soon as they realise that their pain and suffering was truly about to end forever? Regardless of what decision that Richey was truly about to make, the last time Rachel ever saw him, she describes him as being flat and calm, and she thinks that he definitely had already made that decision in his head about what he was about to do. The Manics were due to go back on tour to the US, and in Richey's last conversation with his mother, he told her that he really didn't want to go. In the 2 weeks before his disappearance, Richey had begun to withdraw £200 daily from his bank account. On the 23rd of January 1995, Edwards gave his last ever interview. And on the evening of the 31st of January, as the band were leaving the studio for the last time as a 4-piece, Richey gave them each a gift. He gave Sean a magazine, he gave James a CD and a Daily Telegraph, and he gave Nicky a Mars bar. The night before he disappeared, Richey also gave a book called Novel with Cocaine to a friend, specifically instructing her to read the introduction, which involves the story of the author staying in a mental asylum before vanishing. He made his way that night to the room 561 of the Embassy Hotel in London with a mysterious lady named Vivian. To this day, no one knows who Vivian is or was. The next morning, Richey left a package for his ex-girlfriend Jo and took his wallet, car keys, Prozac, passport, and disappeared forever.